To my 7th video on what I've been learning in my Masters in Psychology. This week I'm going to talk about women's health in reference to what I've learnt across historical, biological and cognitive psychology. So let's get into it. So firstly, in historical psychology, we've been learning about the decolonisation of the curriculum. So what this means is essentially that, the curriculum, particularly at university, is very Eurocentric. It's based on kind of like the knowledge and the information that has come from the West, or from kind of like, well-known countries like the US, Australia and so on. So this means that there are certain voices, certain parts of history and certain ways of learning that has not been incorporated. So across universities there's loads of conversations and things being done to basically decolonize the curriculum and bring a new perspective. The recommendations are in 3 parts. So one of them is rediscovery, so actually bringing in new voices that can kind of like bring a fresh perspective and change what we already know. Secondly is around representation, so actually including marginalized groups and their stories and their ways of learning, as well as their psychology, and the things that they know and that they have done into it. And the third is readiness, so actually exploring different ways of learning that's going to be beneficial for different types of people. So when I refer this to women's health, I think that we're at a stage now where we're obviously going through the big, the era transformation of women's health. And I think there also needs to be a decolonisation of that, in the sense that, do we run the risk of perhaps maybe looking at data that is based on the same groups of people? Do we run the risk of looking at women's health from a Eurocentric standpoint? And I say this as a black woman who lives in the UK, but that can also be seen as a Eurocentric data point, because a black woman living in Africa might have a completely different women's health experience, so when we are looking at the kind of like the next phase of the decolonization of women's bodies, women's health and all of this stuff, we need to take that same mindset around the rediscoveries, actually including new voices, including experiences from women across all different walks of life and across all different experiences as well. We need to be looking at representation, so including marginalized groups, particularly in countries that is not based in the West or doesn't have the Western ideology, because I know that there are many women in Africa who, yes, they may have challenges, but they also have really good habits and ways of doing things that has benefited them probably more than better than we might do in Europe. So I don't know, that's definitely a key area that I think that we should not be ignoring. And then readiness as well, so exploring different ways of learning. So as I come across different platforms, different apps and stuff, I think what we have done is we have created a bit of a script. So this will lead me on into cognitive psychology, where we've been learning about schema and schemata, which essentially is the conceptual meaning so it's a framework of conceptual meaning. So we create scripts. So for example, it could be what happens when you go into a restaurant. So you wait by the till, you're meant to sit down, you order your food, the menu, etc., you pay and then you leave. So we kind of have this mental representation of the script of going to a restaurant or going to a supermarket or even going to school. And I think when we look at women's health, yes, we know that there are this kind of like, accurate data, like, a woman will go on her period every 28 to 30 days and she'll have like the first phase, the second phase, the third phase, the fourth phase, all of these kind of scripts that we've created. But then we do run the risk of overgeneralization and perhaps even forming stereotypes, where we assume that, this is just the way that it is. But where has that come from? Once again, going back to the data perspective, where has that come from, and is there room for difference? Is there room for doing it in a different way? And is there room for different ways of learning? So actually being more creative in how we get this out to people, and how we use more real life examples to help them make sense of it, and how we actually incorporate their own real life experiences, which leads me on nicely to biological psychology, where this week we've been learning about short-term memory and our working memory, but the brain mechanisms required to do so. So some of the key takeaways I took from there was that, for example, our hippocampus, which plays a really big part in helping us retrieve memories and kind of like keep moments together, it works best when items are closely related to each other. So what that means is that if I'm learning about new women's health aspects, or if I'm learning about new habits, what am I already doing that can actually kind of bring it together for me? And more importantly as well, it's about looking at like encoding and previous ways of doing stuff. So if my experience of kind of like, women's health is based on what I was taught as a child, what I learned in school, all of this stuff, then really it's a case of creating new memories and learning new habits. And that requires our prefrontal cortex. It also requires a lot of our visual kind of like our visual working memory. So being able to see stuff, being able to see whether it's images of essentially like how your period is actually like processing, being able to see stuff of what you was doing before, being able to see ingredients, being able to see all of these things, it just means that it can help us form new memories, form better memories, and also learn new habits that that can kind of overlap during a longer time. So to wrap up, this week we've essentially been learning about the decolonisation of psychology and what needs to be done in order to incorporate new voices and new perspectives into the curriculum, where it's predominantly been dominated by Western ideologies and Western thought. And as we also start to decolonize women's health and start to increase our capabilities around FemTech, I think it's equally important that we make sure that the perspectives and the data that we have isn't predominantly focused on women in the West. And then in cognitive psychology, we've been learning about conceptual frameworks and meanings, and how we create scripts, or how we identify certain individuals. So in the things that they do. So it could be like Christians celebrate Christmas and things like that. So when we do come to women's health, we need to make sure these scripts and this kind of like, the ways that we're framing stuff, the conceptual frameworks that we have in mind are diverse. They take into different perspectives, and what success looks like is also diversified, and it doesn't end up becoming an overgeneralization to where we say like, okay, if you really want to have a good period, this is what you should do, this is the way that it needs to be done, this is the script that you need to follow, because ultimately where has that information come from, and do we run the risk of not having everybody's perspective and stuff being taken into consideration. And then finally, in biological psychology, we learned about the brain mechanisms required for short-term memory and working memory, and of course there's the prefrontal cortex, which plays a really big part in helping us create new habits and forms and things like that. There's the hippocampus, which helps us to retrieve and access information that are closely related to one another as well, and there's a close tie between kind of like our visual memories as well, and how it aligns with other brain mechanisms. So that's all I'm gonna go for today, but of course please do your own research to try and understand more of these terms and more of these references. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you. Bye.